Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Guerrilla, in your testimony, you stated that there were only two banks who had violated our Bank Secrecy Act, the Arab Bank in Jordan and the Arab Bank in New York, if I heard correctly. And that's just over the last 10 years. Is that as a result of our lack of capacity to track these folks, or are there others who are complicit that we haven't been successful yet in tracking?
That's the question. The question is, why is it that FinCEN, I think, has done a fairly good job in terms of sanctioning banks that do not have compliant AML, anti-money laundering regimes that comply with the BSA. But with respect to counter-terrorist financing, it doesn't seem to be a priority. And I wonder, is that because of a lack of resources, personnel within FinCEN? Maybe there's just not enough bodies to be engaged in oversight with respect to whether these banks pose a high risk for terrorist financing, or perhaps the weak spot may be with the other federal regulators, that the other federal regulators aren't focusing and emphasizing on whether or not these banks are in compliance with the counter-terrorist financing regulations under the BSA. But it seems to me that it's not acceptable to have only two banks, where if you look at the actual orders issued by FinCEN, the only two banks where I could find references in those orders to threats regarding terrorist financing.
Yes, sir. In that light, as we look at our partners throughout the world, we have relationships with them, many of whom we give tens and even hundreds of millions of dollars of foreign aid. It's always of concern to me of how we are not honored by our relationships with our partners, and particularly in this situation that's so critical for our national security and for theirs as well. To what extent, what would you advise us as a Congress in going forward, and how we could put greater pressure on these respective countries and their banks to be in compliance with our BSA requirements?
One point that I haven't made in my testimony today has to do with the Anti-Terrorism Act. And it does have a civil provision that authorizes private litigants to bring civil tort actions against individuals that commit acts of international terrorism. And I think that statute could be enhanced through amendment to make it a more effective remedy for victims of terrorism, including people, entities that aid and abet terrorists. For example, banks that knowingly provide financial services and transfer money to suspected terrorists. There's several problems with the current legislation as it stands. One, it doesn't explicitly authorize aiding and abetting. And if we're going after the banks, they're really the aiders and abettors. So the plaintiffs are left with the dilemma of having to prove that the bank is primarily responsible for international terrorism through secondary action by being an aider and abettor with respect to the acts of terrorists. So I think in that way we could unleash plaintiffs, we could unleash an army of litigants to go after banks and charities and other entities that are facilitating the financing of terrorism. And again, I think from an equitable standpoint, it's the right thing to do. These are victims. These are the surviving family members of victims of violent acts of terrorism.
Thank you.